Valcha. Welcome back to part 5 of Irish Granny Tarot, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. Not too much tarot yet, but we will get there. So, part 5. We're still doing the litany of people who had these bizarre events, deaths. Sonny Bono. He worked for Phil Spector. In the early 60s, he dated very underage Cher. They got married. They finally broke up. We all know about Sonny and Cher. And they lived in the canyon. They finally broke up, and he left her. He left California. He went to the House of Representatives. And then in January 5th, 1998, he skied into a tree. Now, here's somebody you wouldn't think with this group, but he's closely related, is Phil Hartman. He had many ties to the Laurel Canyon scene. When Jimi Hendrix lived in his mansion just north of the log cabin in Laurel Canyon, Phil Hartman was Jimi Hendrix's roadie. He became a graphic artist and designed album covers for Poco and America, and he's the one who designed the Crosby, Stills, and Nash logo. He was the brother of John Hartman, an associate of David Geffen. John Hartman had begun as a protege of Colonel Tom Parker, who was Elvis's handler. And he worked with Tom Mix at... he worked with Colonel Parker at the Log Cabin and the Spawn Movie Ranch and at the Manson family. And Squeaky Fromm, this is so weird. Squeaky Fromm was a high school friend of Phil Hartman. I mean, they actually were friends. The log cabin guest house, called the Bird House, was built by Robert Bird, who designed Sailor Drive, the Tate House, and the house where Phil Hartman was shot. How weird is that? I mean, these are not necessarily coincidences that mean anything. They're just very weird. Mark Volman, a vocalist for the Turtles, went to junior high school with Squeaky Fromm. So Squeaky Fromm, the Manson family, has yet another connection. It's like a web. Hartman was shot, but by whom? The question still remains completely uncertain. The story, the legitimate story, is that his wife, Bryn, on drugs, relapsed, left the house, returned with 2 different guns. The cops were called, and while the cops sat outside, she shot him and herself. But the book raises questions about that story. That's as far as I'll go. The Wonderland murders in Laurel Canyon. I don't know if it's just me. Let me know what you think. These murders of 4 people, I believe it was 4, don't seem all that awful in the larger scope of what has happened in the news recently. It was a drug trafficking house for heroin, and coke dealer Ron Launius. In Vietnam, he was a killer. That was his job. And he got into drugs. And he was a suspect when he died. He was a suspect in 27 open homicides. He supplied to many of the Laurel Canyon bands. The other 3 he was one of the victims. The other 3 murder victims were his male business partner, his girlfriend, and the girlfriend of another gang member who just happened to not be at home. And there has always been the question, why wasn't he home? Did he know? And where is he now? Some think he is in the witness protection program, that he was an informant. They were all bludgeoned. The second guy, first guy, Ron Launius, the second guy, Larry Williams, was a pimp and a drug dealer. And he was a musician who wrote Dizzy Miss Lizzy for the Beatles. He starred with O.J. in The Klansman. He was found dead. Brian Cole, bass player for the Association. And with Jules Alexander, he was in the U.S. Navy. And this included the Association, Jules, Brian, and Terry Kirkman. And they were all with Frank Zappa. and managed by Zappa and produced by the Byrds managers. In 1967, they were the first act to play at the Monterey Pops. And in 1972, he died under suspicious circumstances. They wrote it as a heroin overdose, but it was never investigated. Lowell George of Little Feat, he was the first band to cut demos with Zappa, and he became what was known as the Fraternity of Man. Then he joined the Mothers of Invention, and then he left because Zappa was too dictatorial and condescending. He couldn't work with him. He pioneered slide guitar in rock. He died at the age of 34, ostensibly of a heart attack. There, rumors have it, drug use. Then there's Nico Krista Fafkin, who was with the Velvet Underground and moved to Laurel Canyon with Jackson Browne, who died of a stroke in 1988 in Spain. Not all these deaths are completely suspicious. They're just it's remarkable how many young people died like this. Chapter 11, Detours, Rustic Canyon, and Greystone Park. Rustic Canyon is 9 miles west of Laurel Canyon. It's where Dennis Wilson lived. And he lived in a log cabin, not the log cabin, a log cabin that had been built by Will Rogers. In 1968, 24 of the Manson family moved in. Tex Watson was already living there in Dennis Wilson's house. Neil Young was impressed with Manson. He thought Manson was a great artist. Dennis said that someday he knew and would tell why Manson did what he did. But he drowned December 28, 1983, under odd circumstances. Vincent Bugliosi, who wrote Helter Skelter, which is a really entertaining book, but in recent years it has been really put up for scrutiny and suspicion. The response to it is a book called The Family. Now, not the family that I have over here about religious fundamentalism, the Manson family. And it's a very good book. I have it. I'll dig it out and get the author. Bugliosi claimed that Manson hoped to spark a race war and emerge to lead when black people were not able to govern themselves. Dennis Wilson lived very deep in Rustic Canyon, far from any civilization, and in Rustic Canyon, there's this very unusual situation. There's an abandoned fire road that has 512 poured concrete steps that go all the way to the canyon floor. This is called Murphy's Ranch, and it's in ruins. Now, listen to this description. There's a 400,000-gallon spring-fed reservoir, sophisticated potable water system, a wall from twin electric generators to light enough to light a small town, more concrete stairs in various canyon walls, just randomly scattered, livestock stables, paved roads, stone retaining walls, an incinerator, a bus left over from Manson, electronically controlled wrought iron security gates, and a formerly electrified fence that encircles 50 acres and an underground tunnel complex. Now, this was in 1933 Will Rogers land, and 50 acres of this were sold to 3 people: Jesse Murphy, Norman Stevens, and Winona Stevens. They had in mind a 10-year construction program, and all of this was going to cost $4 million. But this is 1933. That was a lot of money. They had the hills terraced for orchards. They had a huge refrigerated locker put in. The orchards were 3,000 nut trees, citrus trees, and olive trees. And the huge refrigerated locker built into the hillside. 3 different architects tried to design the house. One of them was Frank Lloyd Wright. It was a mansion with 22 bedrooms, a children's dining room, a gym, a pool, and a basement workshop. It may have been the home to 40 local Nazis from 1933 till 1945. The reason they say may is because they were never able to completely document it. However, there was an armed guard, a contingent of armed guards in silver shirts that looked like brown shirts that patrolled the area. Herr Schmidt was the name of the guy who ruled the place. He claimed to have metaphysical powers. He convinced Winona to build the whole thing because Germany would win the war and they needed to have a place to hide. The neighbors complained because late at night there were military exercises that went all night with live gunfire. And after the war, it eventually became an artists' colony. And in 1973, it was bought by the city and then just left to sit. Then there's this place called Greystone Park between Laurel Canyon and Coldwater Canyon. It's a long, vacant mansion. It was the most expensive private residence ever built in Los Angeles. It was a $4 million mansion, just the mansion alone, in the 1920s. And compare that to Lookout Inn, which was built 10 years later for no more than $100,000, and that had 70 rooms. So this Greystone Park had 46,000 square feet mansion, 22 landscaped acres. It was owned by the oil tycoon Edward Doheny. If you're from LA, you recognize Doheny Boulevard. They were one of the wealthy founding families of the white settlement of LA, based on oil. And when I was a child, you could drive all around Los Angeles, all around Southern California, and there would just be, in the middle of the median of the street, an oil derrick pumping oil out, and it would reek of oil. It's a long time ago. Let's see. In September of 28, the couple moved in, Doheny, right after their wedding, and February 16th, 1929, they were found dead. She was found dead. Somebody was found dead. And, he was found dead, Ned. I can't read my own handwriting. I warned you guys, though. Ned was found dead, and next to him was his dead assistant, Hugh Plunkett. This was a huge scandal. They were supposedly gay lovers, and there had been a quarrel because, this is just very shortly after their wedding, and Doheny's wedding, and, was that a cover? In those days, it was something you kept hidden. So they called it a murder-suicide, but the cops weren't called. Bodies were moved. There was no inquest. And there are suspicions today that this whole situation was probably related to the Teapot Dome scandal. Both of those guys that were dead were scheduled to testify to the Senate. And Doheny's father, Doheny Sr. And because this happened, out of respect, the Senate canceled his testimony. Must be nice to be rich. The new Ned Doheny of the family lived in Laurel Canyon in the 60s. He was a trust fund kid. He was very close to Jackson Browne, Glenn Frey, and he sang with them. He sang with Don Henley, Linda Ronstadt, and Graham Nash. The Greystone estate in New York City was donated to the city and renamed Untermeyer Park, one of the two places, in fact, that the process cult used for rituals during the Son of Sam murders. I've got to find out about these. The other site was the Van Cortlandt Park, named for Jacob, formerly the New York City mayor and forefather of David Crosby. Chapter 12, Riders on the Storm, the Doors. Before Jim Morrison came to Laurel Canyon, he had never been interested in music. He was not a musician or a singer. He never studied it. He didn't read music. He didn't play any instruments. He didn't really listen to it. He never went to concerts. That's a quote from him. And before the Doors, quote, I never did any singing. I never even conceived of it. Asked why desire to learn an instrument, if you could, would you learn one? And he said he had no interest. He brought with him enough songs for the first few albums and a backup band. He brought out of nothing. He said he wrote the songs at the very beginning 3 years ago. I just had a period when I wrote a lot of songs, and those were the only songs he ever wrote. He wrote them at that beginning and then not anymore after that. He was hanging out on the roof of a Venice apartment doing LSD when he met Manzarek, who was at UCLA Film School. So how did these guys get songs out of their head onto paper when Morrison couldn't sing, couldn't play an instrument, didn't know how to read music? And how and why did he transform overnight, seemingly, from this clear-cut guy, college guy, to a brooding, long-haired sex symbol? Then transform, after his music stint, to an overweight, heavily bearded, reclusive poet with no interest in music again. Very, very odd. All four of the Doors had no band experience. Densmore and Krieger were recruited from a meditation class. They didn't play well, or they didn't play at all, depending on who you talk to. You hear Scarlett down there. She's singing along with her new favorite, Chicago. Not the band, the musical. So Paul Rothschild said the Doors were not great live performers musically. They were exciting theatrically and kinetically, but as musicians, they didn't make it. There was too much inconsistency. There was too much bad music. Excuse me. Robbie would be horrendously out of tune with Ray. John would be missing cues. There was bad mic usage, too, where you could not hear Jim at all. But they are the only band that never changed members. In Morrison's band, Jim Morrison's band arrived on the scene as fully formed entity with the name taken from Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception. They had a stable lineup, a backup of soon-to-be hit songs, and no previous experience writing, arranging, playing, or performing music. Other than that, though, they were just your run-of-the-mill organic grassroots 1960s rock and roll band. If you remember, we talked about Elmer Valentine, the cop who was mobbed up. And he bought the Whiskey A Go-Go, and that money came from the mob. And he was a close friend of Morrison's. The Byrds, hate to tell you, the Byrds were completely manufactured. When they got together, they owned no instruments. And they didn't own zero instruments because they left their instruments at home. They had not played any. Naomi Hirshhorn of the D.C. Hirshhorn Museum bought equipment for them. She was enamored of them and bought equipment for them. Only Roger Mcguinn played any music at all, and Chris Hillman never played the bass before. He actually, if he's who I'm thinking of, I don't really know who he is, but if he's who I'm thinking of, he played the mandolin, I think. Cast to be a bass player was Chris Hillman, who had never picked up a bass guitar in his life. Oh, I thought they meant bass like big cello, but it's a bass guitar. As he candidly admitted years later, he was a mandolin player and didn't know how to play bass. But the other band members didn't know how to play their instruments either, so I didn't feel too badly about it. On drums was Michael Clark, who had never before held a set of drumsticks in his hands, but bore a striking resemblance to Rolling Stone Brian Jones, who was deemed to be of more significance than actual music ability. As Crosby co-author Carl Gottlieb recalled, Clark had played beatnik bongos and Congo drums, but had no experience with conventional drums. Richie Unterberger, remember that name, it's going to come up again, noted in his book, Turn, 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 that the guys in the Byrds had barely known each other before getting thrown into the studio, were still learning electric instruments, and in a couple cases had never played their assigned instruments at all. Actually, Michael Clark didn't even have an instrument to start with on his first rehearsal, and even some recording sessions, he kept time on a cardboard box. Gene Clark, though, by far was the most gifted songwriter in the band, and a talented vocalist as well, could barely play his guitar and so was relegated to banging the tambourine, which was Jim Morrison's and various non-musically inclined members of the Partridge Family's instrument of choice as well. David Crosby, tasked with rhythm guitar duties, wasn't much better. Crosby himself admitted in his first autobiography, does anyone really need to write more than one autobiography? That Roger was the only one who could really play. So, and they make the greatest albums in the world. It's very odd. They also 100% lacked songwriting ability. The Byrds' records were manufactured according to Franzoni, Vito's pal. First album cover songs were done by studio musicians. Glenn Campbell on the guitar, Hal Blaine on the drums, Larry Knechtel on the bass, Leon Russell on the piano, and Jerry Cole on the rhythm guitar. In live performances, they were so bad that they offset that by lots of manufactured hype in the media, and Vito and the Freaks dancing around like crazy, drugs, and then the presence of the Young Turks to distract. Oh my God, it's Peter Fonda, that kind of thing. Chapter 13, 8 Miles High and Falling Fast, the Byrds. Terry Melcher, now we're getting into it, was the Byrds' first producer, and he made countless tracks for countless bands in Laurel Canyon. The Beach Boys' Brian Wilson no longer would perform live. He was replaced by Glenn Campbell, another abuser, and he had been in the Wrecking Crew. Glenn quit the Beach Boys and was replaced by Bruce Johnson, who was, in previous incarnations, Terry Melcher's duo partner. I think I may have skipped a page. Yes, this tells about Terry Melcher. Terry Melcher was the son of Doris Day. He was born when she was 17. His dad was the trombonist Al Jordan, who beat Doris Day. His dad killed himself when Terry was 2.5. Day had another second short marriage and then married a guy called Marty Melcher. He was regarded as one of the biggest assholes in Hollywood, and this is a quote from a number of different people. He was tyrannically violent and abusive. He embezzled $20 million from Doris Day. Terry had deep ties to the Laurel Canyon musicians, to Manson, to the Young Turks, and to Polakis and the Freaks. I say his name wrong. Polakis was an art teacher at Terry's high school to start with. Terry liked to go into the art class, not because he was studying art, but because Vito had naked models. And can you imagine naked models in a high school art class? I have a hard time imagining that. Together they launched the Byrds and the Laurel Canyon scene and the youth counterculture. Vito and Terry Melcher. Terry was in a duo with Rexall Drugstore Air, who was in a high school band with Phil Spector. So this guy was in a band with Spector. He joined up in a duo with Terry. Phil Spector's Wrecking Crew, who were all studio musicians, did countless tracks with them. The Beach Boys' Brian Wilson no longer would perform live. It was replaced by Glenn Campbell and then by Terry Melcher's duo partner, whose name was Bruce Johnson. Terry was very close to Dennis Wilson and Greg Jacobson. Greg Jacobson married Lou Costello's daughter. They called themselves, this is gross, the Golden Penetrators. Melcher, Jacobson, and Wilson. Dennis Wilson's nickname was The Wood. These three forged a close bond with Charlie Manson. What a group. In 1966, Melcher and Mark Lindsay of Paul Revere and the Raiders leased Sharon Tate's house and were joined by Melcher's girlfriend, Candace Bergen. Melcher and Bergen, she was the daughter of Edgar Bergen, who had that dumb ventriloquist doll, Charlie McCarthy. Sorry to be judgmental, but I don't like ventriloquist dummies. They creep me out. They're just like small clowns. Melcher and Bergen entertained high-profile people frequently, and they were often visited by Manson, Tex Watson, and the other family members. In fact, Manson used Melcher's Jaguar often. Tex Watson was often there. Was it Sarah Morehouse? Can't remember her first name. She was there. When Melcher moved out, the Manson folks stayed for a while. In February of 1969, Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski moved in, but they all knew each other. Tex Watson in 1966 moved to Los Angeles as a college dropout. In 1968, he owned a shop called Crown Wig Creations on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills and had extensive Hollywood contacts. He did wigs for the stars. Tex Watson, I just don't think of him that way. He handled drug deals and cash for Manson through his shop. He was so close to Manson that he actually, quote, thought he was Charlie, according to people who knew them. Often at the Whiskey A Go-Go, he would sell drugs. Morehouse was his sidekick from Minot. He was involved there in the Process Church and Offutt Air Force Base. And there's some speculation, was this guy from the Air Force Base actually Tex Watson's handler, which is a term used in military intelligence mind control. The person who is the victim of mind control has somebody who is in on the process of mind control, who supervises them, controls them, their handler. In 1969, like that weird Colonel, Kentucky Fried Chicken Colonel was the handler for Elvis. In 1969, the trio also got close to Bobby Beausoleil. He worked for an agency that supplied topless dancers and porn actors, and many of them were members of the Manson family. Beausoleil went with Melcher and Jacobson to the Spawn Movie Ranch in May and June of 1969 to listen to Manson sort of audition for them. Jacobson, married to Lou Costello's daughter, often boasted of his 100-plus hours of deep discussion with the prophet, Charlie Manson. He tried to get NBC to shoot a documentary of this hippie commune. And if you have the opportunity, I don't know where I saw it, but there is fascinating video of these people hanging out just on ordinary days, and it's really chilling. Wilson and Jacobson got Manson a recording session with Melcher, and Beausoleil, who was a really talented musician. He played with Grassroots, he played with Zappa, and he scored King Anger's movie Lucifer Rising. Patricia Krenwinkel was a very high-level guitarist. Steve Clem Grogan was a talented musician. He played in a prison band. Brooks Poston and Paul Watkins were family members, were really talented musicians. Catherine Gypsy Shearer was a virtuoso violinist and a singer. Shearer was orphaned, this is very sad, as a young child, and both her parents had committed suicide. And if I remember correctly, they were Holocaust survivors, and they committed suicide. She was orphaned. She was adopted by a psychologist, and her adopted mother committed suicide. And at 27, she was around for the Tate murders, and she lived with Beausoleil before she lived with Manson. The producer of The Doors, Paul Rothschild, introduced them to Manson and his music. Manson also recorded in Brian Wilson's Beach Boys Fancy Home Studio and did other recordings at the Spawn Ranch in studios in Santa Monica and in Hollywood. Manson actually did a lot of music, more than I had ever known, and I'd read quite a bit about it. He was very involved with all these groups, did a lot of backup, played studio sessions with them, was recorded with them. It's really fascinating. The family made many home movies with NBC equipment because it was confiscated later, and they suspect that NBC was actually encouraging them, like, we won't actively pay somebody to come out and do a documentary, but you guys film yourselves if it's any good. It had enough of a temptation for NBC to be somewhat interested. Melcher produced The Byrds, Mr. Tambourine Man, and Turn, Turn, Turn. He's the one who got Dylan to put his music to electric. The Byrds morphed into this sort of psychedelic rock, and then they morphed into country rock, and they were still learning their instruments. So the very first two Byrds were Jim Mcguinn, who was the son of writers from Chicago. They were famous authors. And he had been in the Chad Mitchell Trio, and seems to me, wasn't that John Denver was in that group? Maybe I'm mistaken, but he went to New York City and was a studio musician, and then filtered over to LA, where he met Gene Clark, who was the second of 13 children. He was very talented. He was from Missouri. He was one of the new Christie minstrels, remember them? And he went to LA, where he and Mcguinn joined forces. They joined up with David Crosby and Chris Hillman, and Hillman was a San Diego mandolin player who went to Berkeley. His father killed himself. He was strongly influenced by a guy called Spade Cooley. So was Brian Wilson. He was the king of Western swing, and I looked him up. You can hear him on YouTube, and he has a really interesting sound. But wait till you hear this. In the 40s and the 50s, Donald Clyde Spade Cooley had a weekly show in Redondo Beach on the pier, and it became so popular as many as 10,000 fans showed up. But he was an alcoholic, he was violent, he was arrested for rape. But then he got a local TV show, the Spade Cooley Hour. April 3rd, 1961. The book goes into details. I'll spare you. He tortured and murdered his wife, Ella May, and forced their 14-year-old daughter to watch. Ella May had told him that she had two boyfriends who worked at the CIA facility at UCLA, and they had initiated her into a free love cult, and she was leaving him and her family and her possessions to join the cult. And they were going to buy beachfront property, and they were going to operate a cult compound. Well, he lost his mind. He killed her. He got a life sentence at Vacaville, but got out after 8 years. He was offered early parole. There was a lot of overcrowding in the prisons in the 60s and 70s, and they just let people out. It's kind of horrifying. Before his release, he got the prison to give him a 3-day pass to hold a comeback concert in Oakland, November 23rd, 1969, and it was a huge success. So now, they gave him early parole, but a few days before his release, he managed to be allowed out for 3 days, and then he was going to come back and finish it up. And then it would be only a total of 8 years. With this 3-day break, he had a concert, and it was a hugely successful concert. And when the concert was over, he went backstage and he dropped dead. Backstage. I shouldn't laugh, but it's ironic. In mid-64, Mcguinn and Clark were doing okay. David Crosby had hijacked the band, and he brought his manager, Jim Dixon, and they added this fake bass player, Hillman, and they added the fake drummer, Michael Clark, and Clark's first Los Angeles address was Terry Melcher's house. And so first they called themselves the Jet Set, then they called themselves the Beefeaters, and then they called themselves the Byrds. Dixon got the band signed to Columbia, and this is a quote from an expert at Columbia. The obvious ineptitude of Michael Clark on the drums, and the shakiness of most of the others is a problem. Mr. Tambourine Man was recorded by studio musicians. And in March of 65, they did their first live show at Ciro's with Vito's freaks prancing all around and distracting. All of a sudden, clubs started popping up. There were no clubs. The Sunset Strip was a quiet place. And all of a sudden, within like a minimum couple of months, all these clubs started popping up. You couldn't drive down Sunset Boulevard anymore. Kids were everywhere. That's a quote. By 67, the clubs were dying because of the Monterey Pop Festival. Between the 16th and the 18th of June in 1967, they did this big pop festival, and they documented it. They made a documentary, and this was before this sort of thing would be live on television, and there was no internet. Nobody had a cell phone. The bands were too popular because of this. They became so popular that the clubs were too small. They had no room. It became a mob scene, and they had to shut it down and take it to arenas. Jean Clark died in 91 and Michael Clark died in 93. They both died of chronic alcoholism. John Mcguinn. Okay, John Mcguinn had joined a cult. And the leader in 1965 changed his name from his birth name to Roger. And a decade later, he became born again. Hillman in the 1980s became born again. Then he became Greek Orthodox. So Crosby, kind of at loose ends, joined up with Nash and Stills under David Geffen. And Melcher was close to Hellman and Parsons and Manson. So there's it's just hard to keep track. It's this web of associations. Bill Siddons, the Doors road manager, had an affair with Squeaky Fromm. So they're all related in some strange way. Okay, I'm going to stop. It's the end of part 5. Trying to break this up so you guys can take a rest. And I don't know, there's quite a bit to go. This is longer than I thought it would be. I hope you're enjoying it. And I'll be back as soon as this uploads. Slancha.